So I hope everyone can see the screen. Does that look right, or do I need to actually enlarge it? Okay. So the
I think you need to enlarge it, Eric.
Thank you. There we go. So the STIR seminar series is a monthly occurrence going through the year 2022, and it's been developed in partnership with Arizona State University Center for Responsible Innovation, the East Association, and Maastricht University. We also have a number of co-organizers, some of whom are here today, and I won't read them all, but you can see them here. We're very grateful for these folks spreading the word, not just about the live seminars, but also about the archived recordings so people can come back and watch them if the time isn't convenient. And of course, not mentioned here are my wonderful co-project directors, Marika Smolka, Cynthia Pickering, and Merrick Pete. The mission of the STIR seminar series is to provide opportunities to learn, connect, and grow the STIR community worldwide. And we certainly have been doing that and are continuing to do that. And today's a good example because I think we've got at least 5 different representatives from 5 different countries on today. So for those of you who are new to STIR or need a refresher, there are 3 basic components to the STIR methodology. STIR essentially assesses capacities for scientific experts to perform reflexive modulation, reflexive socio-technical integration, or the lack thereof. And it does this by beginning with normal expert decisions and using something called a decision protocol to unpack those daily decisions on a regular basis. There are also a number of techniques through which the protocol is implemented. The dialogues take place, and these are guided by an embedded humanist, someone who is usually not trained in the sciences and engineering, or at least that's not their primary discipline, and they're entering the laboratory or the field site or the organization as an outsider, as much as an ethnographer or participant observer would, but they follow a set of guidelines that are a little bit different from most forms of participant observation. And finally, the results of using the STIR protocol are analyzed using the midstream modulation framework. So STIR is something that is typically used to assess capacities for reflexive and deliberate modulations. However, there's no guarantee that we will observe or contribute to deliberate or reflexive modulations, in which case it's the sort of the function of the embedded humanist to then analyze why there weren't any modulations. So whether there are modulations or not is sort of a research question, that's an empirical question, and then the theoretical and interpretive work comes in. And so we've got a very interesting case of that today coming up. The objectives of STIR as a research approach is both to understand the limits and capacity and the nature and limits of expert capacities, but also to explore the scope for expansion, and finally to actually engage in exercising and expanding these capacities without compromising the first 2 objectives. There have been a number of STIR studies around the globe, a number of publications over the last over 10 years, and we're very pleased today to have a presentation, a seminar by 2 of our colleagues in Mexico who have collectively done 4 STIR studies in Mexico, and they're analyzing the results. So I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Juan Carlos Garcia Cruz, who has a prestigious fellowship from CONACYT, which is the main national research funder in Mexico. Independent of industry. So it's like the United States National Science Foundation, or perhaps the European Research Council. And also Cristian Puga Gonzales, who is a PhD candidate at Arizona State University's School for Politics and Global Studies. So very happy to give the floor to Juan and Puga and hear them talking about STIR research in Mexico, unveiling an incarceration triad for responsible research and innovation. So.
Thank you very much, Eric, for the introduction. We're sorry to hear about the COVID, but we're very glad to to see you here and to know that you're doing better. Let me start by sharing our screen. Do you guys see our screen? You see our screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so yeah, thank you for having us here. This is the title of our paper, Sociotechnical Integration Research in Mexico, Unveiling an Incarceration Triad. So let us begin by disclosing what we think that happened to us in this research project. So, initially, so as the cartoon shows, initially we had like specific research goals, and we wanted to perform STEER to get more with these research goals in mind, right? But as we were performing our STEER studies, and as we finished performing our STEER studies, we realized that we hit something else. And as we were analyzing what we found, we realized that our findings could be of use to particular research puzzles. So to be more specific, let me talk a little bit about what happened, our inductive inferential process, in which we decided to change the focus of our STEER studies. So in the fall of 2018 and spring of 2019, we conducted 4 STEER studies. 2 of them were conducted at the Laboratory of Corrosion, which is within the Faculty of Chemistry, and 2 more were conducted at the Biomedical Research Institute. Both of these laboratories in which we performed the STEER studies are part of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, which is the biggest university in Mexico, and I think is one of the biggest ones in Latin America. Taking into account the staff, professors, and students, it's around 300,000, the population of the university, 300,000 persons. So as I mentioned, we had an original purpose, which was very generally to understand the essence of laboratory practice in Mexico. But more specifically, Carlos wanted to know about the relationships between epistemic practices and social and ethical values. And I was more interested in scientists, what kind of power, if any, they had over personal autonomy. However, as we were conducting our STEER studies, and after we finished conducting our STEER studies, Carlos and I had conversations about what our research subjects were talking about, and we find out that in all of our STEER studies there were recurrent topics of conversation going on, despite of course of being separate different laboratory hosts with different PIs and with different lines of research. So we were a little bit intrigued about this recurrency, and what we did is that we grabbed our protocol grids and we started looking for if we were indeed right of talking about this recurrency of subjects. And what we found is that not only there were these recurrent subjects, but that these recurrent subjects were closely associated with one another. So obviously, Carlos and I were ask ourselves, why is this happening? So we turned to see if there perhaps was an overarching normative influencing all of our laboratory hosts. And we found 3 structural features in Mexico that most plausibly were influencing our laboratory hosts to talk about these concerns. And while we were investigating in Mexico, we also noticed that 2 of the structural features that we found are also common in Latin America, and that the literature associates these features with problems Latin America has implementing policies that are already part of political agendas in the developed world. So we saw the possibility of performing a case study, of framing our research as a case study, so that it could help this research puzzle that I'm now going to talk about. So we set up the puzzle as follows. So in Latin American countries with regions such as Europe and North America, which have implemented, for example, the Horizon 2020 project or the Nanotechnology Act, In Latin America, this new conception of responsibility, in which you have to take into account broader societal and ethical values, have rarely crystallized in policies or institutions. And in the ones that it has crystallized, it's only a small handful of countries. So for example, only 5 out of 20 countries have policies that promote social inclusion in R&D processes. And the number of policies are few, 1 to 5. And only 9 out of 20 countries have policies that promote synergies among government, university, society, and private investment. And even in the countries that have implemented these policies, we still find significant problems. So in Brazil, for example, certain R&D projects have been asked to bind themselves to more rigorous ethical standards and inclusivity. But we still find there's still a policy vacuum in Brazil regarding how institutions demand these R&D projects to take into account more societal and ethical values. So what happens is that non-governmental organizations in Brazil end up taking care of this new policies. And in Mexico and Argentina, there have also been attempts to incorporate new frameworks of responsibility, but the policy tools that Mexico and Argentina have proven to be weak to establish the necessary societal linkages between academia, private sector, society, and government to actually achieve their goals. So what's going on in Latin America? What are the obstacles in Latin America for implementing this novel conception of responsibility? Well, certain scholars have already provided a profile of what are most probably the variables that are influencing how successful or the failure to implement these policies that have been already implemented in more developed countries. But the profile that the scholarship has provided is not by itself self-explanatory. We do not know which, if any, of these variables that or part of the profile that they show is more relevant for the puzzle which is why it has been difficult to implement this new conception of responsibility. And besides not knowing which of these are more relevant, we do not know the causal story that might be binding these variables together. So we saw that our findings could be of use to this puzzle by framing it as a case study in which Mexico is our unit of analysis. And what we found is that there are 3 structural features at the macro level, meaning the national level, that are influencing and limiting how scientists and engineers make decisions. These 3 features are funding, what we call regime policy changes, we will explain in detail in a couple of minutes, and bureaucratic structures. So what we're going to do now is first, we're going to show you how we arrived to this diagnosis. And second, we're going to explain why are these 3 structural features, the combination of these structural features, an obstacle for any attempt to implement policies of responsible research and innovation. So as I just mentioned a couple minutes ago, we performed 4 SIR protocols at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. 2 of them were performed at the Laboratory of Corrosion, which is part of the Faculty of Chemistry. It's the picture to the left. And 2 more were performed at the Biomedical Research Institute, the picture to the right. These were typical SIR studies, meaning for each protocol, we had a laboratory host, a control subject. We did it for 12 weeks, in which we interviewed the laboratory host once a week, meaning 12 interviews. And we also applied a pre and post questionnaires to both the laboratory host and to the control subject. So we were performing the SIR studies, we intuitively noticed the recurrence of certain topics of conversation. Particularly, these topics were a common place whenever we ask our research subjects about alternatives, and then they will refer to these subjects when they, why can you perform this or that decision instead of what you're trying to do in it? And they will refer us to either funding, to bureaucracy, or to regime policy. And whenever we ask our subjects about the outcome of their research decisions. So here we have two protocol grids. The one to the right is from the first session of a steer protocol that we perform at the Laboratory of Corrosion. And from the first session, they were already referring to, in this case, to bureaucratic structures and to regime policy, to issues related to administrative and the term political things that are associated to a particular term of office. Here we have in the part of outcomes, they're referring how CONACYT is going to evaluate their work. And in the third session, for example, from the same steer protocol, we have that not only it appears in the outcomes section, but it's part of how the research subject is framing how it's going to resolve the problem that it has for the moment. So it's part of their opportunities to take into account this. What it's talking about here is the direction of academic and administrative affairs within the Faculty of Chemistry. And then the subject is also talking about CONACYT and the national system of researchers. And again, in the outcome section, the subject talks about how budget funding is related to the team in her laboratory and her advisor. So we intuitively, and because of the grids, we knew that there was this recurrence of subjects, but we didn't know if we should trust our intuitions. So we didn't know if our intuition was entirely right, and if so, what was the relationship among the recurrent, what was the precise relationship among these recurrent subjects of conversations. So what our steer protocols gave us was a sub-hypothesis test. And the sub-hypothesis was that in all of our 4 steer studies, there were 3 recurrent and interrelated topics of conversations. And to test this sub-hypothesis, we used a software that is called Atlas Daily, which is used for analyzing text and other and audio and other media. And Carlos is going to explain how we use it.
Okay, thank you very much, Cristian. Yes, we intuitively thought that these topics were important and recurring to the interviews. Is more important, say, Cristian, is based on the sub-hypothesis, the recurrence and relationships of the concepts. Therefore, Cristian and I thought it would be a good idea to review the text in detail. We decided to use the Atlas TI computer software to organize the text, share the patterns, and above all, encode the most frequently use the codes. Atlas TI program, which allow us reinforce the robustness of our findings and the arguments. In this sense, the first decisions was to code a sample of 24 interviews from the 4 protocols. The choice was random, and the work team is currently transcribing in all the material. In the second aspect of the codification was identify the nervy codes. That is to try to locate relationship with the main relationships with the financing, bureaucracy, and political regime. In this sense, is very important, this focus. We place highly related concepts and actor. For example, the administrative relationship with the bureaucracy is very important. The role of the CONACYT. The role of the CONACYT is a regulator and financier, and part of the political positions of the regime, among other aspects, is very important. The points, the relationships. Transcriptions were stored in a sequence Atlas TI, the project file, to identify the hypothesis recurrent topics of the conversation with our data, three both posteriori analytic categories were elaborated. Remember the categories: funding, any mention of financial resource, the other assets that according to the interview, according to the protocol, bureaucracy, and the mention administrative, either governmental or non governmental, with the outside the laboratory. Finally, regimen policy, any mention to elect government official good position directly dependent of the election government details. Finally, in this process, the Atlas TI, the codification, after the coding, we can say according to the categories, there is a genuine concern in the researchers. And about all, subject to the all the codings, we see the traits is a matter that goes beyond efficacy. It is important to mention that the technique and the codifying through Atlas TI help us to organize. Is very important. The points organize is and they try to see some findings that's probably escape maybe us in our protocols or notes or in interview. However, it is the mention, the special mention is the construction of categories of the try comes fundamentally from the application, the method, the protocol still in the laboratories. Yes, this is it.
Okay, so yeah, after we process our transcriptions through Atlas TI, and we use these categories to codify words and phrases that could be associated with each category, then we actually could test our hypothesis, and we found that we were indeed correct. Our intuition was fine. There were indeed 3 recurrent subjects of conversations, and this is what this graph shows is the recurrence of words, phrases, or even paragraphs associated with each of the categories per research subject. So here are the research subjects: A1, A2, B1, B2. Are the research subjects. A1 and A2 are from the Biomedical Research Center, and B1 and B2 belong to the Laboratory of Corrosion. And then we have how much they would repeat words and phrases associated with each of the categories. Here we have funding, which is the most recurrent topic of conversation. Then we have bureaucracy, and then we have regime things associated with regime policy. So once we knew that we did have the recurrent topics of conversation, we turned to investigate what was the actual relationship with among these subjects, which Atlas TI also helped a lot, as we will see in a minute. But also our steer grids and extracts from the interviews also helped us to see these relationships. So funding. So funding was the most recurrent topic of conversation, and this is unsurprising because, as scholarship says, historically funding has been everywhere in science. But we did find some unsuspected links. So, for example, there was a genuine concern with the source of the funding and how our laboratory hosts linked the source of the funding with the sense of responsibility they had. So let me read you an extract from an interview that we performed to A1. And she says, funding, as we have spoken so many times, is something critical for several reasons. The first one is that it's money from the state because it comes from taxes, and we must do the best with this money. And next, this money is a limited resource that we have to treat we have to give the best results with the lowest investment in the most efficient way, so to speak. This is a strong motivation. And funding is linked to bureaucracy and regime in the following way. So we found evidence that there was 2 kinds of bureaucracy. There was this academic bureaucracy, and there is this administrative staff bureaucracy. And both of them were this sort of gatekeepers that not only tell you how to use resources, what resources to use, but also the timing in which you have to use these resources. And they constrained the liberty of laboratory hosts on how to make decisions. So here we have, for example, an extract of A2, another laboratory host from the Biomedical Research Institute, in which he recounts how he had to go through 4 years to actually gain the trust of her advisors to be in more liberty to do the decisions that he wanted to make according to what he knew that could work. So he says, in small yet transcendental research decisions, I have attempted to carefully consider the decisions of my advisor. This has allowed me, for instance, that after 4 years, they may now tell me we need to do this. And ultimately, I have the liberty to perform techniques or trials according to the way in which I have established it or get it done. At the beginning, it's hard to have that liberty because they're not acquainted. Also, the subject of the budget to get the regions, again, funding, is difficult. There's always this nervousness of your advisor on not spending, or that if you're going to do something, you should make informed decisions and not blindly experiment. That is really important. And bureaucracy is also linked to regime policy as follows. So we found that factors associated with particular terms of office, and particularly presidential terms, were influencing how our research subjects were making their own research decisions. So let me give you just an example. CONACYT which is the largest centralized institution for science and technology in Mexico. Its acronym stands for the National Council of Science and Technology. So CONACYT has its own internal politics, where are mostly dictated by the following. The head of CONACYT depends on the president. And in turn, a lot of administrative positions depend on CONACYT's head. So we find that on each presidential term, there is a particular approach to science. So just to give you the example of the contemporary president, he has this thing against neoliberalism. And he has called CONACYT to fight against what he calls neoliberal science. So because CONACYT is a centralized institution that provides a lot of funding, and not also funding, but provides a lot of status, because it gives you levels of how good your production has been, and it ranks you. It gives you level 1, research level 1, research level 2, level 3. Then our research subjects, the decisions of our research subjects were influenced by the politics of CONACYT. So let me just read you the extract of one of our research subjects, this time from the Laboratory of Corrosion. And she says, in the end, it's very complicated to work alone on the experiments, because they asked me for this written work where I mentioned everything that was achieved or the products to be attained from CONACYT. It is important because it's not only the financing of the postdoctoral project, but also I belong to the national system of researchers, ESNI, and it is essential to publish to be able to stay or advance in the levels. Though on many occasions, these administrative aspects, again, bureaucracy, are very slow. However, we have to carry them out because there are few resources for research, and we must be very compliant with the projects to continue advancing. So once we had this, once we did the analysis of the extracts and we had coded the whole thing in Atlas, we started building connections among the codes that we did in Atlas, and also with families of codes. So what we found is that there's a very close connection between laboratories and bureaucratic structures, even a closer connection with laboratories and bureaucratic structures than the connection that it goes to CONACYT to funding. So what happens is that bureaucratic structures function as gatekeepers, which tells you again which kind of resources, when to use these resources, and in what manner for our laboratories. And the funding that is dispersed through these bureaucratic structures comes from centralized institutions like CONACYT, which are dependent on regime policy changes. So basically, what happens is that these three nodes, bureaucratic structures, funding, and regime policies, end up not only limited, but actually imposing what kind of societal and ethical values should be taken into account. So it determines the ethical values, social values, and actually some epistemic values we found. Yeah. So so now we turn to the structural features, to the macro level, to the part of the national thing. So as I mentioned, we talk about it and we said, like, okay, so there must be something above the laboratories that is probably influencing this concern. So otherwise, why would we have this recurrency of topics and that they put so much emphasis on? So what we think is happening at the macro level is that there are centralized federal institutions such as CONACYT that make decisions not only about funding but about new academic jobs and academic projects. And this what is also relevant is that we're in a mode 1 of production, knowledge production, meaning that most funding comes from the state. There is, in some research projects, there is few to non-private investment. So they mostly depend on what the government gives them. And then we have bureaucracy. What happens here is that we found that there's a vertical structure of power in all these centralized institutions. CONACYT is the most representative example, but we have other ones. And what happens here is that the president chooses the head, then the head chooses directors, the head chooses vice principals, and then vice principals decide which research areas are going to be funded according to the mandates or the ideology of the moment. And finally, we have this regime policy, which is, I already said a little bit about it. We have a presidential change, and that changes the director of CONACYT and changes other levels of management within the institution. And then we also have the Congress, which decides how much funding goes into science. And we, as we lived in a presidential system, if the president is aligned, if the Congress is aligned with the president, then there is really no dispute between them, and the agenda of the president regarding science gets implemented. But if we have a divided government and the Congress is not aligned with the president, then we have trouble in how the agenda of the president is going to be implemented, and then we have also trouble in how much money is the Congress going to give to science and technology. So why is this? So now that we have unveiled these three things that were influencing our laboratory hosts that we think that are part of a higher thing, now why are these things an obstacle for any attempt to implement this novel conceptions of responsibility and research and development? Well, we have four arguments that show that. One is that as institutions are highly centralized, there are currently no mechanisms in which regular citizens or societal organizations can affect STI policy or projects, except indirectly through the election of the president and representatives. There's this risk of client relationships coming up between graduate students and PIs, in which the PIs will have connections with higher levels within the organized structure and will mostly impose their agendas, including their particular societal values they consider relevant. Third, technicians tend to prioritize efficiency and relate the values they appeal to make decisions to efficiency. Why? Because this brings more resources for the labs, it brings more ways to justify new research projects, and because there are few incentives to think about values that are not related to efficiency. And finally, researchers anticipate ideological change and try to adapt the justifications of their projects to those new political climates that are coming up in order to secure funding or to secure positions and projects. So as Mexico is, as we framed this as a case study, and we also found that two of these structural features that are common in Mexico are also common in Latin America, which are low investments from the private sector, and that our research and development is mostly financed by the state. And the second one, that science and technology and innovation capabilities are highly centralized, both geographical and institutionally. Then we think that it is possible that because these structural features are common in Latin America, we can perhaps find the same sort of, or at least similar problems that we found with our laboratory hosts. So if the theoretical relationships that we have proposed are indeed empirical, as the same that we just argued, it might be possible that similar obstacles will be found in other laboratories, not only in Mexico, but in Latin America. And this gives us a possible line of research or a hypothesis to test, which leads us to some considerations on STEER, which are, this is not part of our paper, this is just for discussion. So we think that we can, analytically at least, divide STEER into two kinds of research, which of course are interrelated. One is that first, what STEER does first is that it sort of opens the black box of technical decisions and reveals, at least to the steerer, reveals what is going on, what kinds of factors are going on in this technical decision. Why is the technician performing this decision? And after opening this black box, it feeds that information to the laboratory host, and then the laboratory host can or cannot have this kind of reflexive awareness about what he's doing. In this paper, we focus mostly on the first part of STEER, that is how it opens up the black box of technical decisions. And focusing on this part of STEER, we were thinking about these questions, which is, would it be possible to replicate STEER studies? Or at least, would it be possible to conduct STEER studies that's a hypothesis? Because if what we are suggesting is correct, then somebody, if we decided to perform more STEER studies in Mexico, or somebody else decided to perform more STEER studies in Mexico, what our hypothesis would suggest is that that person will also find this recurrency of topics. And then there's a way in which, if they also use our methods, meaning Atlas or some other software, and they use our categories how we define each of these topics, then they might be able to even test the hypothesis we just wrote. They might be able to falsify it. And secondly, how much our STEER findings, what we are, and not only our STEER findings, but everyone's STEER findings, are reflections of some higher order of, or some higher order structural features, such as the politics of the laboratory, or the politics at the national level, or certain laws and institutes that are constraining or liberating or somehow influencing how laboratory hosts are taking decisions. So thank you very much. That's all for us, from us.
Thank you, Puga and Juan Carlos. Thanks very much for that presentation, and both the findings and situating them more broadly, as well as the questions for discussion that you listed at the end. So I've got a few comments in the chat. I've also got a number of comments that were provided in advance by participants, and I'm happy to go into those as needed. But first, let me just open the floor. And Marika, please go ahead.
Yeah, many thanks for this presentation. Yeah, I really liked how you presented these three structural obstacles to implementing STEER in Latin America. But this also brings me to my question, because in a way, I recognize what you describe in Latin America also in other contexts. I mean, that bureaucracy is a huge obstacle, that people depend on political visions in terms of the research lines they pursue. And also the third one, which is about funding driving the kind of research you do. I think these are pretty common also in European contexts, and also in American contexts. And I think in a way the triad is pretty generic and could apply more widely. So that's why I'm curious, what is really particular about the case of Latin America? So if you actually make the triad more specific, what is different in the case of Mexico than, let's say, France, or I don't know, another country somewhere else in the world? So yeah, that's something I'm curious about. Thank you.
So yes, thank you. That's a very good question, especially because if it's really generic, then our paper loses a lot of relevance. But what I think is, well, first of all, this is work in progress. And in order to answer your question, what we would need to do is to do more comparative politics. So the question would be, is the Norwegian bureaucracy influencing decisions in laboratories? First one, is the Norwegian bureaucracy influencing decisions in laboratories? Secondly, is it influencing those decisions in the same way as it happens in Mexico? I think that what's important here is not to take each of these things separately, because the triad is actually that. It's a triad. It's not just funding and regime, and it's not like they're separated. It's how they work together in Mexico. So in Mexico, you have this low investment, very low investment from the private sector into science and technology, which makes scientists and engineers rely more on the government. This is from the part of funding. And then you have the centralized institutions with a vertical structure of power, and you have this policy changing the climate of those institutions, which give you funding, which depend on, and then you have this circle. We would have to go, and if you want to take France as an example, we would have to go into and analyzing France and saying how is different this France from Mexico. So far, I think what we can say is that this is an impediment for, at least for Mexico. We do not know if it happens in France. We do not know if it happens in Norway, and we don't know the caveats of how it happens in other countries. But what we can be more certain of, we never have a 100% degree of certainty in anything, but what we could be more certain of is that it happens in Mexico, and that it most probably it's happening in Latin America because it shares those structural features. So, thank you for the question.
Thanks, Marika, for that question, and Puga for the response. Any follow-ups or any additional questions along that topic? I would add that I would agree with Marika that you know, my familiarity with the research on laboratories and science policy, you know, that extends back to, you know, before the 1970s, is that there's a great emphasis on the role of funding and sponsorship in science and engineering, that this is one of the most established topics. And so there are many examples of why funding matters, how it matters. And I think there are a number, especially more recently, of studies that investigate, for instance, responsibility practices among scientists. Some of these are STIR studies, some of these draw on STIR studies, and some of them are separate from STIR studies. But in any case, they look at the practices of scientists and engineers and often find relations to funding. So I think this is, I think the community as a whole, science policy, STS, innovation studies, I think it's fair to say that we do know that there are funding influences. However, how these funding structures actually influence decisions, this is less clear. It's one thing to compare discursive references, right? So we have a number of studies that have been published that talk about, you know, what scientists refer to, but these discursive references that can be analyzed topically are not necessarily giving you access to the same thing that you might see as a participant observer when you're actually embedded in the laboratory through immersion. And, you know, so it'd be very interesting to compare not just what people say in interviews, but how they behave if you have access to this. And I'm thinking of one finding in particular. There's a link, excuse me, in the paper that talks about not funding, but bureaucratic structures, which again is another, I think, highly documented phenomenon over the decades. But what I was struck by something that seems a little bit different than the US case, and my understanding of the European case, and that is, it's pretty typical in laboratories that have some or a lot of government funding or all government funding to have to follow procedures, right? Procedures and processes to obtain samples, to conduct, to adhere to safety standards, whatnot, to expend resources, to account for resources. But usually these are procedures that are either established by the university or the federal government separate from the funding organization. But in your paper, there was the suggestion that the funding organization, CONACYT, is also somehow responsible for the types of procedures that researchers need to follow when they're going about their data collection and analysis. So I was wondering if you could say more about that, that link between funding organizations and bureaucracy, because that, I think that connection is not as clear in US and European cases.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Eric. That's also a great question. These are very challenging. The connection, yes, we attempt to show that there is a connection between how CONACYT disperses resources and how at least our research subjects claim that that was influenced in their research decisions. And the connection is that CONACYT not only gives CONACYT, what the bureaucracy of CONACYT gives is more like political lines that the project should follow, and when they're trying to justify their projects, the laboratory hosts appeal to this kind of guidelines that CONACYT has for the moment. So it's which is part of a political term of office. So for example, in this term of office, I was saying this kind of the thing about neoliberal science and this. So we have now some sort of a populist president that it goes against free market and that tends to appeal to populist things. And one of them is the issue of neoliberal science. So we found our laboratory hosts attempting to make their projects fit this new line of ideological mandate, if I may, and it is important to follow this mandate because it gets you higher probabilities, one, to get funding, and two, to get more status within CONACYT. So I think that's the most relevant way in which CONACYT influences those decisions. And then you have this other kind of bureaucracy, which is both the PIs and senior researchers and the administrative staff. And that's the closest link the laboratory hosts have to bureaucracy. And the PIs, what we found is that they have this know-how of how to deal with administrative stuff. And our laboratory hosts were relying so much in what they decide and what they tell them. And a lot of their discourses, they would say, oh yes, my PI tells me that this is very important for society. So PIs, either knowingly or not, impose some sort of agenda, and administrative staff, PIs and administrative staff, knowingly or not, impose some sort of agenda and values that the laboratory hosts were taking into account. I don't know if that answers your question, and if you want to do a follow-up.
Yes. Maybe it's important. In Mexico, the change of the policies, ambitions every 6 years when they change the presidents and they change the ideology. Is very characteristic. For example, even more so from different political party in recent years, PAN, PRI, and Morena, different political parties, is the ideological positions is very important in the public policy, science and technology, and sometimes in the objectives and the projects and science on frontier, because it's a description, the research is a description for the actors, the different actors and different actions in the, it's very important this research description, because it's very problematic, the actions, good and bad decisions. No, it's only description what is the problems in the relationship with the financing, funding, political priorities, administrative aspect, because it's very important the focus, because in the interviews it's a constant concept, and sometimes it's a frustrating, or sometimes it's maybe the similar situation and psychology, it's about resources. I hope the resources. This is only example. In this moment, the resource is open, no? Because I understand. I believe I understand what is the relationship, because the relationship maybe it's a hypothesis. Maybe the relationship is the similar in other countries on other states, no? Maybe this is a great reflection, and all the time speak conversation with Cristian. What is the actor? What is the action? And in this investigation, this research is very important. The evidence, the evidence according to the interviews, the protocol, and the processes use Atlas TI, the programs only categorization, and this is yes.
And once again, I want to remark something I said to Mareike, and that is that yes, we can separate this relationship between bureaucracy and laboratory hosts, right? But I think that what is important for the paper is that we should put bureaucracy in relation with these two other factors, which are funding and regime policy. Because as researchers rely way much more on the funding that comes from government, they do not have the liberty to make other decisions. If the research, if one hypothesis would be, if funding would come more from private investment, then they wouldn't have to follow all these kind of guidelines. So I think it's important not to, we can make the analytic distinction between how the laboratory hosts are related to bureaucracy, but we need to also take into account these other two things. After all, the paper talks about a triad, not about just separated features.
Yes, and that's the question. How are these three elements of the triad actually related? It's clear that the three elements appear in your interviews. So they're definitely discursive topics. And I think it's reasonably, plausibly convincing that all three of them do influence decision-making or structure decision-making. I think you guys make really good argument for those 2 points, but do they constrain decision-making in the same way or to the same ends? This is less clear. How do they function to limit the reflection on broader societal considerations? How do they function to close down implementation of societal policies? It's not clear that these things are happening or how they're happening, right? So I think this is where probably you have to present a little more data to really pull us in, so that we see that not only are these present in the interviews and present from your theoretical view of the context, but how do you have evidence that they're actually interrelated? Mareike.
Yeah, I also found what you just mentioned very interesting, this idea that, okay, if we have more private funding of research, then possibly this would facilitate the implementation of responsible innovation principles in research innovation practices. And yeah, I wonder whether this is actually the case, because we have this big amount of literature on responsible innovation in industry, which shows that in industry it's particularly difficult to implement those principles, because these organizational contexts are much more driven by growth related goals, and yeah, whether you can sell something is always more important than other values, right? And of course, we see also a lot of change there. And I'm also aware that the literature is a little bit complex, and that, topics like corporate social responsibility become more and more important. But still, the research, I think, if you look at it from a larger point of view, if you put everything together, then it's showing that it's difficult to do it in industry. So yeah, I wonder if I would go with your argumentation that more private funding means better responsible innovation practices. So yeah.
I'm not sure I said that it would produce more responsible in research innovation practice. What I said is that it would not limit so much how the range of decisions that researchers have. If just having one source of funding and just having one patron, and just knowing that if you do not comply with your patron and you do not follow their ideological guidelines, and if you don't know you do not obey the either medium bureaucracy, which are the PIs and the administrative staff, that limits your scope of what can you implement. I don't know if having more freedom will help responsible research and innovation, and I don't know if private investment would help more, will be more of help to research, responsible research and innovation. But I was just throwing it I think I said as a hypothesis would be that putting more private investment would give scientists and engineers more freedom to perform different sorts of decisions. But I do not know if those decisions will be aligned with responsible research and innovation. So yeah. And Eric, yeah, definitely we need more evidence from our SEER protocols to show the links more clearly, especially with the structural features. As we sent to you, we didn't get to write that part of the paper. We only have till the micro settings, that is the laboratories. We still do not have, we haven't written this part, so it's still work in progress. And definitely we definitely acknowledge that we don't have, we have the evidence and it's dispersed, but we haven't actually written the part. So it's not entirely clear for us how that part is related with the evidence. So yeah, we're gonna keep working on it. It's work in progress.
Absolutely, and I think one aspect that I think cuts across some of the discussion we've already been having, and that you might want to, I'd be very interested in finding, what you learn as you continue to delve into the data, is this idea, and again, it's referred to in the paper sometimes as efficiency, sometimes as valuation. I think of it in terms of a sort of scarce resources mindset or consciousness. This strikes me as something that you could really tease out a little bit more. I don't know if this would be a background to the three elements of the triad, or if it would be a fourth leg because it's cultural as opposed to organizational or structural or institutional rather. But this sense, this may be where you can also start doing some comparative work and saying that even though it's fairly, I think, certain, that's a rather strong statement, but I'll say my perception is that it's not controversial to say that these three elements are found in most, if not all, industrialized nations. But what do they do with them? How do the research practitioners experience these? In some cases, they may ignore them and work around them. There are cases in the US where PIs have said, well, you know, I basically had to say one thing to get the funding, but then I say something else when I talk to my researchers, and I say something else when I'm talking to my partners. And, you know, and there's a negotiation with the funding organization, you know, but this is maybe less of the case in Europe. And then I think it's even less of the case in Southeastern Europe. And I don't know if Mickey wants to weigh in there, but I would just say that if this triad is relatively generic and universal, then the question is how and why does it relate to the results that you're seeing in Mexico as opposed to somewhere else?
Thank you. I don't know if there's any more comments or.
Yeah, well, in the chat we have Lyric is interested in how neoliberal values, and you also mentioned neoliberal science, how this appears in the laboratory, you know, and you know, whether or not you can find links to organizational and political levels. So this is one question, and then Cynthia's got one after that.
So yeah, this is interesting because there's really not a definition of neoliberal science that the government provides. It's not like something that it's defined. Neoliberal science is blah 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 blah. This is just dispersed. But what we found is that laboratory hosts were framing what they think there is neoliberal science is that it goes more to help society than actually following market guidelines. So you have to justify your project so that showing how it's going to help the people or the population of Mexico, rather than or including, of course, just mentioning, of course, how it's going to help economic productivity or these things. But these other things become less relevant. Economic productivity, how it's going to impact the market, or how it's going to impact private investment, and then how it's going to help the people becomes a more relevant thing, and how you should justify your project so that it gets funding, or how you should justify your research so that it gets promoted.
Gotcha. And so, Cristian, does that look like a material outcome in the research proposal?
I'm not sure what you mean by material outcome.
Like, for example, if I proposed a study, I need to verify that it will help the people of Mexico. And so I'm just wondering, like, in the proposals, can that be more ephemeral and kind of ideological, or are they looking for outcomes for what the research can do for people in a material way?
Are there formal
that's a very good question. I'm not sure they would go into that deep. As I said, this is something that is just dispersed, but it's something that is factual, because if you go to CONACYT page right now, you will find this word neoliberal science. We're working against this thing. If you go to the webpage, but it's something that is they don't have like a particular idea of what is it. It's just against this economic bias or something. That's what they have in mind. So
Gotcha.
I think that, yeah, it could be it could be material, I think, but it's just whatever your outcome is going to be, you should justify it in a particular way, even if it's material or if it's other kind of good that you're going to deliver to society, even if it's not material, even if it's knowledge. For example, if it's just knowledge, you have to frame it in such a way that it's going to help the people of Mexico, rather than or putting less emphasis in economic productivity, economic growth, and in the market driven science.
That's really interesting. Thank you for explaining it. And I think it's definitely interesting to compare it to in the States, which seems to be more economically driven.
I would agree. Just to follow up, I would say that it's quite striking that in Mexico there's the premier funding organization is actually making explicit references to certain types of ideological conceptions of science, funding, and benefits. I think the states are distinguished for a lack of explicit discussion. There's not any reference to markets or free markets. It's just understood, right? You have to get into the scholarship and then the critical scholarship, which will point out that this is the case. Whereas it's very different in Europe, where are explicit references, but they're not to an ideology. It's more to European values. And then these European values have been codified, and they can get debated, but there's, general agreement that in pride that European science is different from American science because of European values. But here we have sort of a third type of species in the Conoceet case, and I'd be very curious what Eastern European and also Asian and other South American and Latin American funding organizations say. But I don't want to derail. I don't want to get away from Cynthia's question, but I think that's a spin-off that also relates to the two sides of the question, the topic you guys have just been discussing. One is the sort of the institutional policy discourse, and the other is how these show up in terms of metrics and evaluations, which relates to Bonnie's question.
Yeah.
I don't know if you had a response before we go to Cynthia.
No, actually, I did not.
Fine. And I don't know if Mickey wants to jump in terms of the structural policy. Let's move to Cynthia's question.
Okay. Well, first of all, I really enjoyed your talk today. And I have a question that's along another line, not related to the topic. It may not take that long, so we can go back to, some of the thoughts that were just being discussed. But my question, I was looking at your protocol sheets from the STIR that you had on this slide. It looked like you were possibly conducting the protocol discussions in Spanish.
Yes.
Okay. And so I was wondering, as you did the transcription and then went into Atlas TI, does it handle Spanish, or did you have to translate to English to get it to do the Atlas TI part?
Yes, these are two methodological concerns, very important. One is how you do transcriptions, and this is something that it's in the literature that you have to pay attention, or if the person that did the interview is doing it, he has to attempt to remember how was the interview performed, the body language that was being used, what kind of things were being emphasized within the interview. So transcriptions is one thing, and yes, Atlas can do it in Spanish. So transcriptions were done in Spanish, and that was one methodological concern, to actually transcriptions that would represent what actually happened during the interview. The second one is translating those extracts, and here again we face a problem of interpretation, because as the saying goes, something might get lost in translation. So what we attempt to do is to do translations as verbatim as it was possible for us. Of course, there were things that just didn't make sense if we translated them verbatim, but then we provided the most accurate interpretation that we could produce of those translations. But yes, that was a methodological concern. Yes. Thank you. Yes.
Great, thanks for that question. I've got a few additional questions that are sent down, but Marika, please ask yours first.
Yeah, I have another question regarding change over time, because I would be curious whether working with the STIR protocol actually helped researchers better deal with these obstacles, so that ultimately they changed their decision-making because of enhanced capacities for reflexive sociotechnical integration. So whether, let's say, working with STIR can actually help subtly disrupt these wider structural issues, or widen people's room for maneuvering within these structural constraints. I mean, there are different ways to express it. And I don't expect, of course, that people are suddenly able to completely go against the dominant funding streams, but whether there were moments where at least like a tiny bit, they could evade, work around the limitations that they're usually working under. Thanks.
Let me say what I think, and then Carlos can jump in if he wants to. We did find a lot of reflexive awareness. That is, they notice what they were doing, and then, but it was very hard not to make them, because they may want to perform different technical decisions, or they may be there might be aware that there's a different route to get to the same result. But again, they were very constrained on how on the things that they could actually do. They were constrained, and again, it goes to bureaucracy. They were first bureaucracy, how the PIs were telling them, you have to use this, and you have to use it in this manner, and they may go and ask if they could do something else, but then it's not going to be their decision. It's going to be the PI's decisions. And then, of course, again, the funding, how they should frame it, and how they should reply to CONACYT's demands, requests. So I think they're kind of there is a lot of reflexive awareness. It's not that they didn't, perhaps they didn't want, we didn't ask them, would you like to change this? And then as we were reviewing, perhaps it could have been a good question, but that came a posteriori, so we couldn't go back and ask them, would you be willing to change it if you could change it, your decision? But we did notice that we're finding this kind of a monster, that it's kind of invisible in there, but it's at a higher level structure, and that they were very constrained on these things. But we had a lot of nice findings. We find even aesthetic values. So, for example, at the Biomedical Research Institute, there was this person developing a micro version of a tank where bacteria can grow a particular protein. And she was not only concerned about her research outcomes, but it was also concerned about how nice it would look, how beautiful it would look. Why? Because these things may be useful to teach children about science. So she was also concerned with aesthetics. And she didn't know that she was concerned with aesthetics. And she realized, because she was putting it in this way, and I said, why don't you just put it straight? And she said, no, because it looks better this way. And then I realized, like, oh, well, she's thinking that's not only some technical decision, it's taking into account something else. So yeah, we had a lot of findings regarding reflexive awareness, but then about deliberative modulations or deliberative reflexiveness, then those were more difficult, and again, they were very constrained with these three features that we found. I don't know if you want to jump in, or
just is there for example, in the laboratory of corrosion in chemistry, is the main values is the technique, or sometimes the artifacts, the models. And I remember the artifact minicell. The minicell is the artifact for apply for the experiment. And these discussions with conversation with Cristian is the according to the action theory, the literature, is the artifact is very important, no? Because it's the decisions according the technical decisions for the experiments they use, they apply, or sometimes the writing papers, no? The writing papers, it depends the artifact. It's very interesting in the point, because in Mexico, in the laboratories in Mexico, depends in great portion the exportation resources, the elements, and sometimes the bureaucracy is it's a tragedy because it's 1 year they waiting for the artifact. I remember in corrosion, another aspect for the social values is very interesting, but because the corrosions, the elements, the sculptures, the cultures, the patrimony in Mexico depends the corrosion, because the corrosion is very affect the sculptures. In this research, is the project is about the inhibitors of corrosion, ecology corrosions. No, is very reflexive because there is ecology, because in the world the ambiental the complicated situation in the environment is very complicated. No, yes, I think in. For the question, thank you for the question, very interesting question and amazing. I think another aspect, no, in the protocol, the applied protocol is another aspect. No, for example, in epistemic values is very important. Epistemic values because the context or discover of context or it's very important, and with I decision with Cristian, what is the focus in this research, no? In this working paper? No, it's only 3 concepts because the other line of research is very interested in for ethic values, and I agree with Eric because I need the organization, the evidence, because it's very interesting because I agree for the comments. No, it's the point, the different points.
Yeah, and yeah, just to give a follow up on Carlos, because she just mentioned something that I hadn't thought about. That is that artifacts also limit how people make decisions, and in this case, artifacts are given again by a bureaucratic structure, which is not that flexible. So again, one way in which bureaucracy limits decisions is through the artifacts that gives the researchers to work with. And that's just something that came up and I hadn't thought about. I think it may be too much for this paper. It's already a lot of things that we need to justify. And for now, we're just gonna stay with these 3 things. And we're gonna try to make the case that or at least investigate how is Mexico different regarding these 3 things that are common in other countries. How is Mexico a particularity, or it's not a particularity, but maybe it shows then that if Mexico is not a particularity, then it shows something that happens probably elsewhere, right? So anyways, there's a finding there. Either way, even if Mexico is not special, then this might be happening in a lot of places, and if it is special, well, then it's a particularity of Mexico. I was wondering, now that you're mentioning that these things are very generic and very common, how much of your STEER research participants recurrency of these topics, or how much your laboratory hosts that you had we're talking about these topics, because if they're so generic and you must have also have some sort of findings regarding this, or you must probably remember something about how your research participants talk about this thing. So I was wondering if you find any similarities or differences regarding what we have up till now.
Yeah.
Ulrika or Cynthia, did you guys want to? I have some anecdotes, but I want to hear what you guys say.
No, I just first wanted to clarify that also my question about tracing change over time was not a suggestion to change your paper or include it. I'm just curious. I think you could write several papers actually on the data you have. It's just one of the nice things about STEER that you can actually look at developments over time. But I fully agree that your paper is already rich in and of itself. So Yeah, and I mean, I can only say one short thing, just because I now just started my new project in Germany, and it's very interesting how often bureaucracy is mentioned here as an obstacle to research. Actually, more than in the context where I worked before, let's say the Netherlands. There I didn't do a steer study, but just in general, right? I mean, I'm among researchers still. So that's just already something that's very striking. But since I only started, a couple of weeks ago, that definitely deserves more investigation. And I think your paper now sensitizes me also to look into exactly these three factors and how they relate. And so, yeah, I can talk to you more in probably half a year or so. Yeah.
Thank you.
So in the context of my STIR studies, which are conducted with undergraduate students who are learning a particular technology and then working on a project to apply that technology. So they're making decisions about how to apply the technology. That's often in a social context. I don't think they're concerned so much with funding. Things come up like the decision structures. So sometimes they might say something like, I'm not the primary decision maker. I need to follow what the head of the project is saying, or the chief technologist is saying. But then they come to realize, oh, I can have small autonomy in very local decisions about the piece I'm working on. And I guess in terms of funding, it's not so much their funding, but the decisions I make, depending upon how much it costs, can have an impact to the end user of a product, especially one that might be in an economically disadvantaged situation. So that's the closest I can come to like mapping onto that triad, I guess.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I can just provide a couple quick anecdotes. One is in terms of, the tacit knowledge, as you call it, or the expertise, the administrative expertise or bureaucratic expertise. I think that's really nice. That actually did give me pause when I was reading the paper, and I thought this is very interesting. If we socialize scientists into all sorts of things, but they usually don't get socialized into bureaucratic structures until they leave the classroom and they go into the laboratory. And then this also, another question was, that's just sort of an observation, but a question would be, why is it that we can't socialize them into things like responsible innovation? And I think an easy response to that is, well, one is sort of quantitative and metric and formal, and the other is much more open and unstructured. But I think it's nonetheless an interesting question that you raised with that remarkable observation. And of course, there are numerous observations in the studies I've conducted where this type of tacit knowledge is acquired and is utilized and is a gatekeeper or an obligatory passage point. There are also cases where researchers and PIs are talking about or complaining about funding regimes and also regulations, such as having to really be inconvenienced and to lose a lot of time. But I would say what's remarkable is that in every case, there was still this high drive, this energy to sort of push past those and to accomplish goals and objectives that other scientists or actors might have been discouraged and left behind. These people that I observed nonetheless figured out, right? I don't have the material in my laboratory. I can't get it through my university. I'm just going to get on my bicycle and ride to another laboratory and then ask for it and bring it back because I'm driven to do this thing. Also, I wanted to point out, it's another interesting potential observation in your study that there seems to be a contradiction in what, in this case, Conceit is asking for, or at least within the regime. And of course, these contradictory values and discourses and objectives and mandates are also commonplace, but it's important to explore them and the tensions and how the actors respond to those tensions, because this is sometimes a case of interpretive performance or performative decisions. So, does one spend more time listening to the part of the regime that says be efficient, or does one listen to parts of the regime that says think about societal benefits?
Yes.
Right? Or does one win out in every case? We talk about societal benefit, but we really just follow efficiency. And if so, what is the logic there, or what are the mechanisms there, depending on what you want to look at? Or I guess in your case, how would the three elements of the triad reinforce those practices?
Okay. Thank you. Great comments. Yeah, we also you were mentioning that you found that in your chair practices you encountered this researchers that could ride their bike to another laboratory, and this was also a common something that happened here. The problem is that other laboratories have the same things, so they have to deal with PIs, or their PIs have to contact the other PIs so they can actually have access to the other laboratories. But then it's kind of the same thing, because then they are not following the guidelines of the PIs, but of the PIs. So PIs again, and bureaucratic structure end up imposing whatever agenda they have on the researchers. And there's also this thing about self-financing, which is when they got really upset about something and they couldn't hold it anymore. They just used their own money to buy whatever they needed. I mean, small things, because the Gonzales doesn't give much money to PhD students, but still if they got really tired, they would actually go and do it themselves with their own resources, or with their own friends, or whatever they could find. Yeah.
Very interesting. This is just purely my impression. It could be wrong, but my sense is the UK. Well, I think it's well established that the UK has something called the impact agenda, and that this has had several waves, and it sort of got more and more stringent up into the pandemic, at least. And there's a massive scientific pushback against the impact agenda and the sort of the overly evaluative, metric-based performance evaluation that really lots of UK scientists were saying this is really limiting creativity and productivity. It's hurting science. But I'm less aware of studies, ethnographic participant observation studies, that find scientists are, they somehow internalize this when they're actually conducting their research, when they're making material, when they're engaged in material practices. Could be wrong, but my sense is the material practices have not been affected by this policy layer. What has been affected is the way proposals are written, the way careers are evaluated and formed and move forward, right? It's got a huge impact, but not on the material practices. But what you guys are finding is that the material practices are infused with this efficiency agenda. And so again, this is a potential possible point of comparison.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for those comments.
Well, we've got another minute. Any closing comments or remarks from our presenters?
Yep. As I mentioned, I had two considerations on STEER. One is how the research goals might be divided analytically, at least, not once it's performed, but at least analytically it could be divided that way. And if our theoretical suggestions are right, then would it be possible to replicate STEER studies? Would it be possible to go and test or attempt to falsify a hypothesis that it's already been proposed by another steerer? Maybe use the same methods, the same analytical categories, and go and investigate if the subjects are actually recurring in other Mexican laboratories or in other places, and if such, how make some sort of comparative studies about STEER and using some sort of replicate method. So
I think it's a great question, and my response, a quick response, is the half of STEER that is formalized and is essentially replicated every time we do a STEER study. So STEER studies, to some extent, do replicate themselves or replicate the original pilot, right? Because there's a very strict systematic approach to the research. But the other half of STIR is very spontaneous and intuitive, maybe not intuitive, but it's more messy and it's not structured, right? So STIR is a semi-structured approach. So it's more similar to unstructured participant observation. So this would be the part that you would have to control for if you were going to assess across STIR studies. So you would need to look at who the investigator is and how he or she or they are, what themes they're choosing to amplify, right? So there are choices in STIR, and these choices are not structured, and these would be the variables that you would have to identify and then control for.
Yep. All right. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Cristian and Carlos, for your presentation, your seminar, for thinking through our questions. We're all thinking about these things. I think they're really common across STIR studies and across many responsible innovation studies and many STS studies. And that is what are the structural configurations that ultimately contribute to shaping research outcomes when it comes to societal responsibility, and in particular, in respect to the autonomy, the agency, the discretion, the decision-making that laboratories and scientists and engineers have. You found a very interesting set of patterns, and they're becoming more and more, I think, self-reinforcing. So it'll be very interesting to see how you guys continue to develop your thesis. So please join me in thanking our presenters today, and we look forward to your results in the future, and we'll see you guys next month when Mickey Lukovics presents on Eastern European studies.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Wonderful comments. Wonderful comments. Very, very helpful.